Oh hi, I'm the heretic. Following that the government's costs increase exponentially as the population increases, and the economy they parasite becomes more sophisticated, requiring greater expenses to monitor, restrict, and tax, they will inevitably reach critical mass, where simply collecting revenue is more than their actual revenue. Eventually, they will have to scale back, close government agencies. The logical conclusion of this is the closure of the government itself. Hooray! The government's gone, we're finally free! Not so fast. Just because a state's gone doesn't mean sociopathy has been eradicated. There are still crazy, evil people in the world, and we're not exactly on a blank slate either. Some people are charismatic, and can charm people into following them. Others are skilled, and could easily manipulate events and people in their favor with nobody knowing it was them. Corporate executives, or just generally people who got rich off of government meddling in the market before it was free to exist. These people have a large reserve of resources. With these skills and resources, statists argue, they will eventually take over as warlords. This is what is known as the Warlords problem. Those who espouse the Warlords problem argue that sociopaths aren't going to go away just because the state's gone. They'll still want power, political, economic, or otherwise, and will use whatever means necessary to achieve it. Even worse, there will be many completely ordinary people who have no such bloodlust or malevolence towards their fellow man, but are simply more comfortable in chains than in freedom, and will rally around any aspiring warlord to help re-establish order. As such, any stateless society, the argument goes, is doomed to fail as warlords fill the power vacuum left by the state, where the country will either fall under the parasitism of another coercive monopoly or fall into a Mad Max-style hellscape of perpetual constant warfare. Ultimately, they argue, we're better off without warlords, aren't we? First off, how much of this is true? A state of constant internecine warfare is something I think we can all agree is undesirable. As such, we wish to avoid barbarism. Now, the goal of anarchism is a society in which all social relationships are voluntary. This is, unfortunately, not universally achievable. In many tribal societies, for instance, the absence of a coercive monopoly is not due to any primitive enlightenment, but due to the brutality of society. Any individual or group that would claim authority by calling themselves a government would just be killed by other tribe members. The overwhelmingly high homicide and infanticide rates in primitive and Mesolithic societies are evidence of this. I touched on this on my video on child abuse perpetuating states, but the point is, statelessness of tribes is not evidence of primitive enlightenment, simply that statelessness does not always translate to a voluntary society. Now, the warlord's argument suggests that statelessness will never translate into a voluntary society, but the burden of proof is on them. We come to the first problem with the warlord's problem. Somehow, by extension of what I said previously, a civil society would devolve into barbarism once all services traditionally provided by states are provided by private firms. The burden of proof, however, is on the one proposing the problem, to explain how a society can be peaceful and civil under a state, yet be ungoverningly brutal under statelessness. As though reality were an AMC drama or a Netflix original show or movie, where society is full of sociopaths chomping at the bit to screw everyone over the instant they can get away with it. The difference is that that's actually true, except they give themselves titles like senator or police officer. So the question proposed is that because Thanos didn't use the Infinity Gauntlet on these sociopaths, how can we prevent them from seizing power and institutionalizing their malevolence? Again, the default argument that the state is the only thing standing between ordinary people and a constant warfare hellscape, which makes sense at first glance. After all, while we do live in a society parasited by the state, we enjoy a reasonable expectation of safety. We're not dodging bullets, or hiding underneath bulletproof vests just to get to work. Surely this means the state is good at keeping people safe, or at least good enough. but governments are constantly at war, both at home and abroad. The US has been at war for 226 out of the 243 years of its existence, the last period of peace being in 2000. The War of Northern Aggression in 1861 demonstrated government aggression against the domestic population for daring to disassociate with the US government, brought forth to its next stage with the Drug War or the War on Terror, which manifest as the US government using violence to stop Americans from acting in ways they don't approve of or for owning certain forms of property. Forget about the US government's previous aggressions or the drug war. Every government around the world uses the threat of violence to coerce behavior. Failure to comply will result in you being aggressed upon until you either comply or die. How can this be anything but an ongoing civil war between people and the sociopaths who would call themselves our rulers? In Europe, the state uses violence to stop people from speaking certain sentences or typing certain words on the internet. In Islamic countries, which includes most of Africa, they will kill you for having sex with the wrong people. Every tribe in which people are misled into believing aren't tribes, with labels like nation or country, is in a constant state of civil war of the ruling class against the rest of us. Tell me, how are politicians not warlords? The heads of state in almost every nation on Earth is the commander-in-chief of their military. Weirdly, North Korea is one of the few countries where this isn't the case, but the commander-in-chief is still subordinate to the heads of state nonetheless. Violence is monopolized in the hands of the rulers, who enforce their monopoly on arbitration on you. The only difference between a military junta and a constitutional republic is that one wears a military uniform and the other a suit and tie. The main thrust of the warlords argument is that the threat of private warlords is equally as, if not more dangerous than a tyrannical government, without any proof to back up their claim. Proponents appeal to the Hobbesian state of nature, that people formed governments voluntarily as a way to insulate themselves from the state of nature, which Hobbes described as short, brutish, and nasty. But Hobbes had it backwards. Everything the state has was taken through appropriation or conquest. Its jurisdiction imposed without the consent of those they seek to rule over. The idea that the state formed voluntarily is absurd, and no such voluntary formation of the state has ever been proven or observed to occur. Even if a state of nature were short, brutish, and nasty, statists have failed to demonstrate how coercive monopolies are the only organization capable of protecting people from it. Surely if everyone voluntarily agreed that being violent dickbags to each other was not in their interests, why would they seek to establish an arbitration firm that enforces its monopoly through violence? That would be like filling your car's gas tank with concrete. Insanely counterproductive. It's also why I must insist that the warlord's argument states in the absence of a state, society must be ungovernably brutal, as opposed to governably brutal. Just a side note. But if anything, life is short, brutish, and nasty because of the state, not without the state. Any argument that a voluntary society would fall under the control of warlords assumes that this would be a change and isn't already the status quo, unintentionally admitting the absence of warlords in a voluntary society. Funny how the worst case scenario statists can conceive of is for a free society to develop a state. Heedless of this cognitive dissonance, they insist the way to avoid warlords is with warlords. At this point, the absurdity of the warlords argument is plain and obvious to see, and I don't need to go any further. But let's go deeper. Is it possible for sociopaths to use their resources to conquer territory, collect taxes, then snowball into another state? Well, first, states being able to gather armed forces and businesses doing the same is not a one-to-one translation. States can coerce. They can manipulate the economy such that the only way to get ahead in life and, say, get a job or pay down student loans is to join the military. Feeling that, they can simply enslave people into fighting their wars for them through conscription. A business, or some rich asshole with a pile of cash, can't do any of these things. They have to hire soldiers, negotiate pay and benefits with each of them. In addition, the soldiers need to be equipped, given food, barracks, clothes. They might demand recreational facilities and exercise facilities. This requires access to water, electricity, likely internet, fuel. In addition, any aspiring military force needs weapons and armor, as well as staff to maintain and train people in their usage and maintenance, as well as additional land for garages and hangars, munition storages, armories, and fuel depots. All of this requires very significant expenditures. By now, producers realize they can sell their war materiel at higher prices without hurting profits, and soldiers for hire realize they can negotiate higher wages. Any rich snob sitting on a giant pile of cash is seeing their reserves depleted, and they haven't even started their takeover yet. Shareholders are beating down the door of the CEO of Evil Corp's office, screaming about why he's spending so much money on an unprofitable venture. Surely the kind of slaughterhouse charnel pits like Vietnam, the World Wars, the War of Northern Aggression, or most other wars in history would have been far more subdued or even averted had both sides been paying professional soldiers market wages and if they were enslaving conscripts to be maimed, traumatized, and murdered on the battlefield. All of this assumes the resources these aspiring warlords are using to fund their fiefdoms are still valuable. There's no guarantee that the exchange value of any commodity they're holding onto will still have value. Some old guy might try to privately fund an army with the $100 quadrillion he's kept in a vault for years, but what good is it if nobody wants to be paid in Confederate money? Gold sounds good, but a jump in supply from, say, asteroid mining could drop the price down and therefore his purchasing power significantly. So let's keep this in mind. In order to even get to the point where they can begin their operations, they need a vast store of resources. These resources must still be valuable following the state's collapse. They must be able to afford their massive and increasingly expensive military, their support staff, training, and equipment, as well as afford their upkeep. Now, for this military to be profitable, it needs to collect more in taxes than it costs to operate. However, a military force of roughly 100 soldiers plus support staff, armor, and equipment will have hardly the reach it needs to fund itself, so it needs to scale upwards. Eventually, this aspiring warlord's army comes to the problem of diseconomies of scale. Diseconomy of scale refers to the point at which the cost to produce an output scales up exponentially, usually as a result of difficulty in coordinating and communicating with a larger workforce, the law of diminishing marginal returns, and other inefficiencies that compound and entrench themselves in larger firms. This problem is exaggerated under violent firms, such as states or the fiefdoms of aspiring warlords. As they have no competitors, or violently fight off competitors, they have no incentive to lower input costs. But let's ignore all that. Assuming that in addition to the previously mentioned hurdles that he's already overcome, the aspiring warlord has a massive, nearly inexhaustible supply of resources, and desires to profit from his fiefdom. Ideas such as simply retiring off of his resources or speculating into productive and potentially profitable enterprises simply hasn't occurred to him because of reasons. Instead, he wants to just take what others have, so let's go ahead and get started pillaging. Except pillaging is only good for short-term gains, since victims are disincentivized from productive activity. After all, why would you grow more food than you need to survive if you know it's just going to be taken from you? I don't think this is controversial after all, recognizing this is why states formed in the first place. Gangs of bandits recognized it was in their long-term interest to limit their plundering so that they can keep stealing it in perpetuity, as well as coerce their victims into mafia-style protection rackets. We'll assume the warlord seeks to tax rather than pillage. Okay, so how do they collect? They need not only tax collectors, but assessors. They need to know how much people take, and people to collect it. They need to know what people's incomes are, what businesses' incomes and revenues are, who's trading what, where, how much, what the prices are. This kind of surveillance state requires a large amount of staff and facilities to maintain itself and will only grow exponentially as the economy becomes more sophisticated and economic activity becomes harder to track. Especially as the economy moves more towards encrypted peer-to-peer networks, which makes economic activity nearly impossible to track and by extension, tax. In fact, it's this exact mechanism that collapsed the state in the first place, preventing them from being able to collect revenue. The aspiring warlord would have to overcome this exact hurdle of finances and resources being nearly or completely decentralized in a stateless society. He'll find out pretty quickly that collecting taxes in this situation is nearly, if not completely, impossible. But we're not done yet. The warlord needs to hire soldiers to arrest people who fail to pay their taxes. They would need prisons to house and punish tax evaders. These prisons need guards, support staff, maintenance, food, water, another massive money sink. But the important part is that the very existence of a stateless society implies that a warlord is completely unable to fund themselves. Therefore, this entire enterprise will operate solely on the warlord's already existing well of resources and the willingness of vendors to sell to the warlord. The warlord's empire will never be profitable. The only warlords willing to go this far are either unbelievably stupid or so megalomaniacal as to forego material gains entirely. Even assuming our aspiring warlord is a complete and total lunatic, motivated solely by a desire to dominate, and somehow had an enormous cache of resources that were still valuable after the collapse of the state, even if his cache was large enough to amass an army, able to fund appropriate facilities, equipment, armor, and support staff, as well as a fully functional surveillance state and prison system, he wouldn't be able to sustain it. No amount of one's own sparkling personality can override that soldiers and tax collectors need to put food on the table. Something that's impossible if the warlord is completely broke and unable to pay their army. All of what we've talked about assumes that nobody rises up to defend their property. People don't want to be enslaved or taxed. No matter how large his army is, the warlord will always be outnumbered by property owners, who will find being ruled over to be a threat to their interests. As such, people have a material incentive to defend their and their neighbors' property. If they don't want to fight themselves, it still creates an economic need for security firms, which will undoubtedly cooperate and coordinate to neutralize the warlord. Remember all that money the warlord spent on weapons, personnel, staff, facilities, and stuff? Well, those firms would not have sold them in the first place if they did not perceive a profit. One could argue that because of the warlord patronizing them, they actually now have more resources with which to defend themselves than before. It's like if Bob is a Chicago Bears fan. He sees Bill selling Green Bay Packers jerseys on the street. Now, the two sports teams are rivals because of reasons, but anyways, Bob sees that Bill has 10 jerseys to sell, but he doesn't want Packers fans to have them, so he buys them all himself. He takes them to his house and then burns the jerseys as an offering to the sports gods for victory next Sunday's game. Meanwhile, Bill had all of his inventory purchased. He is beside himself with joy. With the profits he just made from selling the jerseys to Bob, he can now sell 15 jerseys next week. If anything, Bob just made his problem worse. The same thing happens to the aspiring warlord who buys weapons from those they wish to conquer. All buying 10 assault rifles from the gun shop did was help them afford 20, which they'll use to defend against the warlord. And even then, a voluntary society has more indirect ways of dealing with an aspiring warlord. Those utility companies don't want to associate with a violent warlord and will cancel their contracts, refusing to supply the warlord or his armies with food, water, or electricity. Food vendors will refuse to sell to the warlord. Banks, assuming they still exist at this time, will freeze their bank assets. Even more, those employed by the warlord will be targeted in the blacklisting too. Open bounties will be posted on the warlord's assets by various firms, encouraging freelance captures or even assassinations on the warlord's troopers, the theft of their assets, and sabotage of their facilities. Sure, the warlord might have the facilities to be independent and self-sufficient, but his troopers and their support staff don't. To say nothing of how economic specialization works. Sure, not every vendor will honor the blacklist, but given that these businesses risk being blacklisted themselves, in addition to the damage their reputation will suffer from associating with violent thugs, they'll be forced to jack up their prices to offset the risk. For this reason, the cost of employment with the warlord will be too great for his employees to justify their continued relationship. They are incentivized to quit, if only so they can put food on their families' tables again. To say nothing of self-preservation from all the malicious and security firms fighting back against the empire. So what we have here is an aspiring warlord. He somehow acquired the resources to afford this enterprise to begin with, and was both intelligent enough to see the collapse coming to prepare for it, while megalomaniacal enough to plan this out in advance, yet somehow not intelligent enough to take this plan to its logical conclusion and realize that it was doomed to fail in the first place. Anyways, so he has the resources. Now he starts to build his army, without shareholders, board members, or family members convincing him to stop this lunacy as he's bleeding money already. He starts conquering territory, and is bleeding assets even more quickly as he expends ammunition, fuel, and his assets are destroyed in warfare. Any territory he does somehow conquer is less valuable and taxable due to previous hostilities. Taxation is near impossible due to financial decentralization that caused the collapse of the state to begin with, so his armies can't collect revenue, and simply pillaging is not a profitable business model, at least not for very long. All the while, any business partners the warlord still has are either freezing him out or jacking up their prices to astronomical levels, making his fiefdom not only more expensive to maintain, but encouraging mass desertion. Unable to maintain and finance his empire, it collapses, and the warlord is left with nothing but the ire of his would-be victims and the knowledge of what any sane person should have realized up to this point, that warlords cannot gain power whatsoever in voluntary societies. Let's ignore all that. Let's assume by some space magic, the warlord is blessed with a literally infinite supply of a valuable resource. Never mind the fact that we've entered levels of whataboutism that are impossible in reality. The warlord is loaded. He can afford as large of an army as he wants. He's set. He's gonna take over the continental US with no concern for the profitability of his fiefdom. Even then, there's still problems. Because the warlord has infinite resources, he can afford to pay vendors that sell to him and his soldiers any price that they ask for, no matter how much above market value it is. Economic demand is need plus affordability. And if the warlord's affordability is infinite, then he has infinite demand. Entrepreneurs would be quick to exploit that, offering shoddy or defective equipment for a price high enough to retire on. The warlord has infinite cash. What does he care about what it costs? So, no problem, right? Not so fast. Much like how the overwhelming demand for graphics cards among crypto miners caused their prices to skyrocket, prices elsewhere in the economy will similarly escalate. Especially as more of this infinite resource the warlord has access to enters the economy. What happens in supply curves as supply increases? Price goes down. What happens to currencies when their supply increases? The price of an individual unit of currency plummets. But what does that mean? Inflation. If the warlord's infinite resource isn't a currency, its exchange value will still plummet, as its supply in the economy skyrockets. since it is unprofitable for vendors in general to value their resources in rapidly inflating currencies or commodities. They'll exchange using currencies that can retain their value, even if they have to invent one. And they'll stop exchanging with the Warlords' resources. Since vendors no longer want the infinite resource the Warlord has, his access to infinite resources has ironically destroyed his purchasing power. Ain't inflation a bitch? Look, it's simple. There's no way for warlords to seize power in a voluntary stateless society. The costs of even attempting to do so are too great and the profits too non-existent. As technological innovation marches on, the cost of maintaining a state becomes too great for states to maintain themselves, and it is something that warlords may very well find out the hard way. Though most amusing is the lack of self-awareness that comes from appealing to the warlords problem. To protect from roaming bands of warlords that murder, kidnap, and steal, we need another warlord that murders, kidnaps, and steals called the state. All this is just to trick you into thinking that your material interests lie with the preservation of a coercive monopoly. But you know what? I agree with those who appeal to the warlords argument. We're better off without warlords. So this video was a remake of my Warlords problem video made from years ago. I've made my point about warlords already, the video's over. If you don't want to hear me comment about my older video, I don't blame you. But anyways, yeah. I know way more now than I did when I made that video, and although my arguments were correct, I didn't quite take it as far as I could have in terms of why a warlord is doomed to fail, or even why the premise of the question is utterly hypocritical. Hence, the need for a remake. Anyways, I hope I did this question justice. Let me know in the comments below. Support me on Patreon. Like, share, and subscribe to become a heretic today.